Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcabbage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers podcast. And today I've got another guest with me. Her name is Dr. Kathy Veon. She is a doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine, and she's got a whole bunch of other letters that go after her name as well. Probably a smart woman, and she is going to talk to us today about something called EMFs. And you may or may not know what those are, but we're going to do a deep dive into what an EMF is and how it kind of surrounds us and how it may or may not be having significant impacts on our health, unbeknownst to most of us. So, Kathy, welcome to the Thyroid Answers podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. We met from through a mutual friend, Dr. Kelly Halderman, who's the co-author of my book, The Thyroid Debacle. He said, you've got to have her on your podcast. She would be awesome. So we had a little discussion and we talked about this idea of EMF. So we're going to talk a lot about that, how it may impact. This is the Thyroid Answers podcast, thyroid physiology, but really, I don't look at thyroid physiology as a separate thing. I think of it as part of the overall physiology. So it's about how EMFs can impact our overall physiology, not just thyroid physiology, but overall health, but thyroid physiology as well. So can you give the listeners a little bit more of a background on who you are, what your experience is, why they might want to listen to you a little bit, and then we'll get into a discussion on EMFs.
Sure, absolutely. Well, by training, I'm an acupuncturist. I've been practicing for about 16 years now. I also am a clinical nutritionist. I love learning all about nutrition, holistic therapies. I have, over the years, found many different tools to add into my toolbox to help patients. Along the way, though, I always had known about EMFs and the impact that they have on people. However, unfortunately, I discovered firsthand just how harmful they can be. I happened to be overexposed unintentionally to EMFs from a malfunctioning Samsung S5 phone. And at the same time, the building that I practice in actually had a upgrade for their connectivity. So they went from having 3 Wi-Fi routers to over 40 Wi-Fi routers, all in about the time period of about 2 months. I started to experience a lot of strange symptoms that I would come and go, such as swelling in my ears, headaches, skin rashes, all kinds of very, very strange symptoms. And of course, they would come and go. And as my training with an acupuncturist, I thought, wait a minute, this is wind. This is something that's coming and going. It's not something that's coming from inside of me. It's something that's coming from the outside and is affecting me. And over the course of about 6 months, I was able to figure out that it really was related to Wi-Fi and cell phone exposure. It was really the culmination of events where I was home for Christmas break. I wasn't actually going into the office. I had a new Wi-Fi router installed in my home because the other one the house had been struck by lightning and it had not worked anymore. Of course, the new Wi-Fi routers are extraordinarily strong. I didn't know any difference, so I just had it put in because that's what they said to do. And within a couple of days, it became where I couldn't even walk. I mean, I was in so much pain. I had extraordinary headaches. I never get headaches, so I knew something was very, very wrong. My ear canals had swelled so large and the pressure was so intense in my head that literally I just cried. And I ended up, having this moment like, oh my gosh, it's the Wi-Fi. I know it's the Wi-Fi. I go in, I turn it off, and it took 4 days to recover. And the swelling was so intense that the skin in my ears had flaked out because it had been that swollen. It was just so shocking to me, the intense effect that it had. And of course, that started on a journey. First of all, I had to figure out, how can I heal? I know this is affecting me. I hired a building biologist to come out to my home and then also here to my office to let me know what I needed to do. This building biologist, she was so helpful. She came in with all her high-tech gadgets and meters, and it was really quite an education to learn from her. And she turned to me and she said to me, well, can you move? because that was really the answer. Like she said, you should not be here. You're not going to be healthy here at all. Like no one should actually be in this building. And I said, well, I can't move because I just signed another lease. So again, that got me on a journey of how do I shield this? And you'll see it. I'm here in my office right now. I had to have custom panels made behind these panels that you'll see. They're actually theater panels. There's 3 layers of commercial grade foil that's meant specifically to block RF radiation, which is radio frequency radiation, which is the kind of radiation that comes from wireless devices, which is going to be cell phones, Wi-Fi, cell towers, Bluetooth, all those kinds of things. So I had all of that done to my office. Went through the whole healing process of doing different therapies for detoxification and resetting my neuroimmune system. And I was able to function, fairly well. I still avoid exposures. I don't use a cell phone. I don't have Wi-Fi or any kind of other kind of wireless device. But I can tell you my life is so much better. And what I've been through really helped me to understand and have compassion for other people who are suffering. And they may not know why they're suffering. They're just having all these symptoms and no one's telling them what's going on. So that was really the beginning of my journey that has, over the years, it's been about 8 years now that I have been on this journey. And in that process, I decided to go and do an advanced clinical doctorate. And the topic of my paper was all about EMFs. It was really more of a public health paper about how we as practitioners really need to learn about this so we can help our patients, because this information is not being taught in medical schools. It's not being required as continuing education for any medical field that I know of. And so that leaves us as medical practitioners ill-equipped to help the patients that are coming into our offices, because if we don't know, how are we going to help our patients? And our patients are really being robbed of the knowledge that they need to have so that they can make a full recovery and live safely.
Yeah. And listen, I agree. There's potential for problems here, right? And we don't know a lot about what's going on, but play the devil's advocate, right? Somebody's going to be like, Kathy, come on, right? Everybody's using cell phones. How could it be a problem for everybody if everybody's using them, right?
Yeah.
And you're not going to see any phone company stand up there and say, yep, what we're doing is creating a problem. So how do you have that conversation, like as a starting point, like, hey, these things you can't see in this stuff that's surrounding you, that you can't feel, you can't touch, you can't see, may be having harm to you. How do you even have that conversation with somebody?
Well, and I go to the science. And again, this science has been published. There's been research going on for decades. And it really goes back to actually the military and even foreign country militaries. Communist countries have, especially Russia, and they have actually did the original studies. They used this type of frequency as weaponry. So if you look back through the research and the studies in the 1950s, the Russians did use these frequencies to harm the US embassies in Russia. And they, some of them actually lost their lives or their families became very, very sick. And I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of research by different companies such as Ford Motor Company and even our own military that is really available online if you know where to look. Of course, you're not going to find it on the mainstream media because, again, when you turn on the TV, who are the advertisers? Telecommunications are the big ones. So they're not going to lose their big money by telling the truth. The other thing I like to even talk about is even more recently, the FCC was sued and they lost. So back in August of 2021, it was determined that the FCC has ignored the science. They have been handed thousands and thousands of pages of peer-reviewed research. They've been handed a couple of hundred real case studies, real people, a lot of them children who have been harmed by exposures to Wi-Fi in schools and cell phones and so on. And the FCC has had this information for over 10 years, and they have refused to review it and refused to change their standards, their safety standards. And the High Court basically determined FCC, you are in the wrong, and you must answer. You must answer why you have not made new safety standards based on real science, not on the science that you're holding on to, which is really more based on heating and not so much on the oxidative stress mechanisms.
Yeah, so a lot, ton of stuff to unpack there, but I think one of the things, I was going to say something when you were doing it. I think I saw a documentary a while ago on a whole bunch of our, I don't know what you want to call them, operatives that were in Russia, that were having these mysterious illnesses and saying, hey, there is something going on here. And we were looking at these people like they're crazy or they're nuts or whatever. But here it came out that this is exactly what was being done there. I know it's hard to believe that the Russian government might do something like that, but yeah, it was kind of like disturbing. And you think about it, like, really, can that really do something? But now we do understand it, but yet then we still have all these things that are coming out and we're carrying them around voluntarily, and not realizing it creates a problem. So maybe what we need to do is kind of step back a little bit, because some people are going, what are you talking about? Radio frequency, and you're talking about EMF, and you're talking about different types of radiation. So maybe let's go back and do like a 101 introductory course on like, what is EMFs, what is ionizing versus non-ionizing radiation. Can you kind of just back this whole train up a little bit and give us some like 101 on this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several different forms of EMFs. The one that we're really mostly talking about today that's coming from wireless radiation, that's radio frequency radiation. And that's going to be in the range of any kind of wireless. And that's including actually radio. It's including microwaves. It's including 5G, all the Gs, the 1G up to the 5G and to the Gs that they still want to bring out in the future. So anything that's wireless, anything that's connecting by Bluetooth, by Wi-Fi, anything that's not corded is typically going to be communicating with radio frequency radiation. And that's it's non-ionizing radiation, which was thought to be safe. However, it is found that actually it works in a different mechanism. It works more on oxidative stress mechanism, which has vast implications to overall health. Whereas the ionizing radiation is going to be something more like X-rays and things like that are, much more severe, known to create more immediate impact of DNA breaks and cell damage and tissue damage. Whereas the radio frequency radiation, it's more of based on intensity and long term. So, and even in a lot of the research that I looked at when I was doing my doctorate work, we use radio frequency radiation to heal as well. But the difference is the healing frequencies are different, they're healing, but then also we're only using them for a short period of time. We're not walking around with these frequencies constantly bombarding us all the time, because when it's something longer than just short term, meant for healing, and it's long term, that's when the cell damage, that's when the oxidative stress, that's when the changes start to occur in the tissue, is really the long term exposures and the high intensity exposures, like right now is, we have a lot of 5G, which is going to be a much, much higher frequency.
So I want to dumb this down even more, right? So we've got energy, right, that we can't see, and that's moving through the air. We can't see it, right? And so it's always crazy that you can send me a text message and I get it within seconds, right? But that's energy moving through space, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about EMF, we're talking about electric and magnetic energy that's just traveling through space, right? And so it travels as a kind of a wave form as it goes. And when we measure a wave form, we talk about the frequency. That's how many peaks, just like the wave in the ocean, how intense and how quickly those peaks are gives a certain frequency. Can you talk about, so from that standpoint, can you talk about what is high frequency, low frequency, and then we can kind of get into maybe what the ionizing means versus non-ionizing. We do have a lot of people that are in the profession in our space, but we also have a lot of just people that are just everyday people listening. And I think we got to get it to a point where they really understand the implications here and what this stuff actually means.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about low frequency or ultra low electrical frequencies, those are going to be more along the lines of our electricity, motors, like high tension wires. Those are going to be along the lines of the lower end of the spectrum. And as we move through the spectrum, we go into then more of the microwave frequencies and the wireless frequencies, and then on up into more of like the X-ray type frequencies, which are going to be the most damaging frequencies, that most damaging in the short term as well.
So for the listener, think about the waves at the beach, right? If I had a low, slow rolling wave coming in, it's not very intensity. There's a big gap between one wave and the next one. That wave is less likely to create damage to whatever it's hitting. But if I'm in the water and I've got really quick, rapid waves hitting over and over and over again, that's going to potentially create more damage. So when we're talking about a frequency of a wave, and Kathy's going to correct me if I'm saying this wrong, we think about how quickly those wavelengths are peaking, how close together those peaks are hitting. And we typically assume that the higher the frequency with that intensity, that's what causes damage. And we kind of look at those and we kind of measure it in hertz, which is that kind of wave form, the frequency of how hard those things are hitting. And so the higher the hertz of something, we've always kind of thought about that. The higher the hertz, the higher the frequency, the more potential it has for damage. So low frequency things, we always said, hey, they can't cause a problem. The wave is not intense enough to do a big deal. But these higher frequency things like gamma radiation and X-ray radiation and some of the therapeutic tools that we use, they can cause more damage, right?
Yeah. But even, I mean, they talk about even the lower frequencies, like the high tension wires. I mean, there's been studies even back into the 70s where, you know, people who live under these wires or too close to these wires, there's a much higher incidence of even childhood leukemia and other changes in the blood. So, you know, when we think about all of these man-made frequencies, again, they're chaotic. They're not from the earth. They're not native. There's something that we have created, and our bodies are not used to that. So our bodies have been conditioned and accustomed to all of the natural and healing frequencies really of the earth. And in limited, you know, exposures, the sun and the stars and the moon and all these different things that give off frequencies, our bodies have adapted to that. But because these new frequencies, these man-made frequencies, they're brand new. I mean, we really have not had much time for our bodies to adapt to that. And that's where we're really not prepared to be able to handle that. And even we're going into, you know, the nutritional side as well. Nutritionally, we're very deficient. And we look at even something like, you know, this is talking about thyroid, but iodine. I mean, most people are severely iodine deficient. And of course, that plays into a role of why people are not able to handle these higher levels of exposure to different types of radiation. We're nutrient deficient in many, many ways.
Yeah. So it's an issue when we're thinking about the radiation. You're talking about the power lines and stuff. And I would agree, those studies are out there. That's not talked about, right? We typically, with the people, I don't even know how to say it, but the people in places of authority are saying, hey, those things, that power line's not going to bug you. It's low frequency. It's not going to bug you. Your cell phone's not going to bug you because it's low frequency, but it's been thought that those things that are lower frequency in the past, and even currently by the powers that be, that those things aren't problematic. We can put this electrical power grid, power lines right next to your house. It's not an issue. It's not a problem. And yet we hear not just anecdotal stories of people saying, hey, my health declined after this power line went down the line of my property, or these power lines were run underneath, you know, under my property line. I really started having some health issues. people say it can't be because it's low frequency. It's not a problem. We know that it's the high frequency stuff, but there is literature showing, not just anecdotal information, but there is literature showing that these things can have an impact. So let's kind of talk about high frequency when we talk about, and let's kind of break this down two ways. One, we talk about frequency being ionizing and non-ionizing. It's typically thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, the higher frequency is the more ionizing. We need to explain to people what the heck that even means, ionizing, and low frequency is thought to be more non-ionizing. So can you explain what those two things are?
Well, I mean, the ionizing frequencies, again, these are things like X-rays, and I mean, there's a reason why X-ray technicians, or when you get your dental work done, they know now they want to cover the thyroid. They want to cover your body. When you have these diagnostic tools performed, because they are at a much higher, more damaging at the cell level, they are much more likely to create DNA breaks. And so they were thought that was the only kind of damaging type of radiation, was the ionizing radiation. Whereas non-ionizing radiation, it doesn't have the immediate ability, because it's a much lower intensity and much lower frequency, to create that damage. But they're finding that over time, and because of the mechanisms that it works with in the body, with creating oxidative stress, depleting melatonin, depleting all of your stores of glutathione, and creating calcium influx into the cells, creating mast cell activation and increased allergies and inflammation. So they weren't really, I think, at first widely aware of that. And they became aware of these other health side effects. And it's not just for humans, it's doing this to our animals, to the insects. I mean, there's many different implications of what these frequencies can do at the non-ionizing level. So it is going to be, again, non-ionizing is just not as intense as the ability to break DNA.
So when we talk about ionizing, for the listener, just so you make sure we're all on the same page, when we talk about ionizing, these frequencies can come in and they can, you have a molecule, an atom. Back in science class, we learned about the nucleus and the atom and the protons and electrons, but these forces of energy can hit this molecule or this atom, and it can pull an electron off, right? And you'd say, what's the big deal? Well, we can have something that's maybe neutral and doesn't have a lot of reactivity to it. Now we pull off this electron, and now we've got a potential molecule that's more reactive with other things going on in the cell. And we also got this electron that's now floating off that can create some potential damage. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. Yeah, that's a good analysis. Yeah.
And so if you think about it, like, hey, you mean that radiation that I'm getting, I'm just getting those x-rays on my teeth. I'm just getting that, I just want to take another x-ray of my spine. They're not healthy? They're not safe? No, probably not a great idea. We do this to a lot. We do this to women, right? We take their breast tissue, we smash it in between some plastic, and then radiate it with these ionizing radiation. And why are we doing that? We're doing that year after year after year to find out if there's damage to the breast tissue. Well, wouldn't smashing the breast and then radiating it be a potential trauma or damage to the breast tissue that in time could lead to some disease or pathology? To me, it's like, we do what to somebody on a regular basis? Yeah. And so maybe we could talk about some options as we get through that process. But that's this kind of ionizing versus non-ionizing. It was thought that the non-ionizing radiation, because it didn't separate the molecule, it couldn't create any problem. But the literature and research that is out there that you're talking about says, hey, there are other ways these low frequency non-ionizing rays that we're getting from our cell phones and our Wi-Fi and these other things, we don't see it, we don't feel it, we can't touch it, can be changing our tissue. So can you kind of elaborate a little bit on how you said it depletes maybe glutathione or creates oxidative stress? Are you aware of, do we know how it does that?
I mean, the biggest mechanism, I mean, there's still researching and studying to know exactly what these mechanisms are, because I mean, they're learning all the time. I mean, one of the main things is, of course, the oxidative stress that it creates. And not only the biochemical oxidative stress, but the stress to the cells that the body is aware of that maybe we're not consciously aware of. And that's what's creating also like the cortisol, the rise in cortisol, the stress response, adrenal fatigue, because our cells are constantly being hit and bombarded and basically tapped and pounded on all the time. It is a constant stressor, even though we are maybe consciously not aware of it. That also is creating systemic, I guess,
Adaptation is the word I would use.
Yeah, it's creating a systemic stress on the body, where the body's never resting. The body's never at peace. There's never, it's always chaotic. So that, I think that's the best way to describe it. It is a very chaotic, non-life-giving type of frequency. And again, to compare it to what is life-giving, that's going to be like the frequencies of the earth. They talk about the Schumann resonance, and they talk about how important it is to be in nature and to engage in earthing, because the earth has its own frequencies that we have adapted to that are actually very healing for us. And again, the man-made non-ionizing radiation, it's extraordinarily chaotic. It's not natural. Our bodies are not used to it. And our bodies do react to it because it is a stressor. It's something foreign that our bodies are having to deal with. There's also other speculations about peroxynitrates, which is or peroxynitrites, which is a very strong oxidative substance. And again, that goes back to the oxidative stress. When the body creates a lot of peroxynitrates, the body responds by having to use its glutathione to put out that fire. So when you think about, we were adapted to create our own glutathione to get us throughout the day and get us through the exposures in our environment. But once we added in all of these extra frequencies, our bodies, pretty much we use up all our glutathione stores in the first 5 minutes of waking up, when we're exposed to all these. Our bodies are not equipped for that. So what do we have to put out that fire if we're just eating a normal diet and not supplementing with glutathione or other antioxidants? And that's where, again, the breakdown comes, is because we do not have the stores of the antioxidants or things that can help counteract that constant oxidative stress that we're being exposed to. Because every day, just living and breathing in a normal everyday world, our normal metabolic processes will create oxidative stress. But on top of that, we have this inordinate amount of the EMFs, the radio frequency EMFs, the other stressors in our environment that, again, our bodies aren't equipped to deal with that.
So for the listener, what she's saying sounds a lot like what I talk about quite a bit, that we, from a cellular perspective, our cells operate in one of two modes. We're either in low stress, what we call homeostatic regulation, which means the stress on the cells and tissues is not excessive. I make all the energy I need to do to deal with the stress. It's not a big deal. And my primary focus is manufacturing. I want to bring in lots of nutrients. I want to bring in glucose and fats, and I want to have lots of thyroid hormone in the cell. And I want to make stuff. I want to make hormones and peptides and proteins and hair and skin and all this great stuff, because I'm primarily in manufacturing mode. And to do that, thyroid hormone is one of the major regulators to turn on the machinery, for genes to replicate, for energy to be made. So it's really important to have lots of T4 brought into the cell, converted into T3, turn on that manufacturing process. But T3 does another thing inside the cell, and it turns off a lot of the cell danger mechanisms. And what Dr. Kathy's talking about is that EMFs can contribute to the thing I talk about all the time, and that's the stress load. A lot of times when we think about stress, we're thinking about like it's one thing that does it. I don't think it's often one thing. I think it's the load over time. That's our issue. And the analogy I always use is I've got two cinder blocks with a board going across, and the stress of life is like 5-pound weights that I'm putting on that board. And if I go through life and just keep putting load of 5-pound loads on that board, and the capacity of the board's 100 pounds. As soon as I get to 105 pounds, that board is going to break. And then you assume that the last 5-pound weight you put on the board was the thing that caused all your misery. And it really wasn't. And if it was, then I should be able to just pick off the 5-pound weight and life should be good, the last 5-pound weight. But it never works that way. What's happened? If I take that 5 pounds off, I've got a broken board with 100 pounds on it. How do I fix it? I got to take all 100 pounds off, rebuild the board, reinforce it, put new stuff in, then I can stack it on there and put it on there. So it's often the load, and people worry about they're going to have to eliminate stress in their life. You're not going to eliminate stress. You're always going to have stress, and stress isn't bad. Stress is what makes us stronger. It's what makes us tougher. It makes us more resilient. It's our fitness to deal with that stress. How quickly can I take that stress and adapt to it and use it as a positive force? Or can I stress the tissue, allow for recovery, and then I should be okay? And one of the things Dr. Kathy said before was the problem was we've always been experiencing some level of radiation, but even with medical procedures, we radiate the tissue and then we take it away. And now the tissue gets to heal and recover. But what we're doing with these cell phones and these in the Wi-Fi and everything else, it's a constant bombardment, and it changes the physiology, and it takes us from manufacturing physiology to cell defense physiology. When the cells start to perceive too much of this frequency coming in, it senses danger, and now I've got to shift from making stomach acid, digestive enzymes, hair, healthy skin, and all these wonderful things we want to have happen to cell defense. And from a physiology perspective, how do I help change this manufacturing to cell defense mode? One of the things cells do is they decrease the conversion of T4 to T3 inside the cell. And what that does is it slows down manufacturing, and then it unlocks some of those cell defense mechanisms so that we can release more inflammation, more signaling molecules that then tell the immune system, holy cow, we are in danger. And now we get these inflammatory defense mechanisms going on, and they're constant and chronic. And then we feel tired and I'm constipated and I don't have stomach acid, and we think it's broken physiology, but really what the body is doing, it's adapting. And what Kathy is saying is, hey, this constant bombardment of radiation that we can't see, we can't touch, we can't feel is contributing to that load, and nobody is really paying any attention to it. Is that fair to say? Did I summarize that pretty good?
Absolutely. And it's even more than that. And I want to go even just a step further and talk about one of the other mechanisms that this radiation has been shown to do, which is to break down the blood-brain barrier. So this is why the radiation that we have, the wireless radiation that we have, coupled with heavy metals, glyphosates, mold, I mean, you name it, like every other environmental toxin that we have, it just puts a fire to it. So we're seeing just a massive increase in people with neurological problems, with autism and other types of mental health issues even. And really that we have to look at what it's doing to the brain as well. It's breaking the blood-brain barrier, breaking down that protection and allowing all of these toxins to get into the neurological system and create havoc. So that's another part of it. It's because it's not even just the oxidative stress systemically. It's also, what is it doing to our blood-brain barrier? What is it doing to our protective mechanisms of our neurological system?
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to talk about some other factors and influences, but I want to help the listener also understand this oxidative stress component and how this ties not just the damage at the gland, but the cell level, which is what I talk about all the time. If that cell is under stress, right? Let's do it this way. When the cell is in low stress homeostatic regulation, there's always a little bit of free radical formation. We'll call that exhaust. That's made by the cell. When you make energy in the cell, you're making some exhaust. But we have an antioxidant system in the cell that helps get rid of it. It's a great balance system, right? Like yin and yang, right? I make some oxidative stress, but I got this load of antioxidant molecules that can also keep it at bay. Your mitochondria, just taking food energy and converting it to ATP cellular energy, creates some level of free radicals, right? And if it's excessive, we call that oxidative stress. but having these antioxidants prevents it from being oxidative stress and it's just a balance. But if we have cell stress going on, one of the defense mechanisms is to increase some of those oxidative free radicals to deal with the threat to some degree. And if there's damage, that can cause some issues too. But keep in mind, if you have your cell only makes a certain amount of antioxidants like glutathione. And if you have your energy, your mitochondrial system going at full tilt, making its free radicals, and now you've got free radicals that are being associated with this excessive stress response, you quickly make more free radicals and you've got glutathione and you get oxidative stress, which then can damage and destroy cells. Adaptively, what does the cell do in that situation? It downregulating T4 to T3 conversion and having less T3 in the cell, your mitochondria gets downregulated. We push less stuff through it, less spillage out. And that seems like a bad thing, but it's really, to me, an adaptively great thing. If I don't have enough free antioxidants to deal with both of these things going on, what's the thing I need to spend more time on is defense, not on making more energy and exhaust. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we're not getting the rest. We're not getting the rest we need from our the rest and recovery. One of the other aspects, I think, also even from more of a genetic standpoint, is what is it doing to our autophagy? So our autophagy processes, some of the research talks about how it can impair autophagy. So people who already have a impaired ability to cleanse the debris out of its own cells just from everyday metabolic processes, the EMFs coupled with the influx of what the EMFs are doing with all the other toxins in the environment, that's creating an issue as well. So again, it's so complex. There's so many different mechanisms of how it's really pounding us down in so many ways. Inflammatory responses, I had mentioned earlier about the calcium influx with all the mast cell activation. And again, that's one of the things that I'm seeing also is overactive or immune response, where a person is becoming allergic to everything, and that's in part because I think people are being exposed to all of these EMFs and that abnormal influx of the calcium in the cell, creating these inflammatory responses and allergic reactions as well. So again, it's not just one thing. It's not three things. It's not five things. There's so many different mechanisms because these EMFs affect us on every metabolic level. And that's why it's difficult to really pin down the very specific symptoms because the symptoms are different with everybody and they change with everybody through time, depending on their levels of exposures, depending on their genetic makeup and where their weak spots are. So that's why it's so elusive. There's not just one thing, and it is different with everybody. I mean, I have people who come in and I can tell they're being overexposed to EMFs because they have headaches. Other people are experiencing thyroid problems. Other people can't sleep. Other people are having heart problems. So it affects every different metabolic process in our body uniquely, in part based on a person's own genetic makeup and lifestyle. So again, it's so much more complex. And again, I think that's why it's difficult to pin down. When you say someone has pneumonia, well, okay, I know all the signs for that. It's pretty much the same for everybody. It's not the same with EMF exposures. It affects the whole person.
Right. And that was the next question I was going to ask you. Is that one of the reasons why you feel that allopathic or traditional medicine doesn't really hit this head on, is because what we typically like in allopathic medicine is this causes this and that I can treat that, right?
Yeah.
Where like we think about like organisms, that organism causes diarrhea, therefore it's a problem, but we give less consideration as to the commensal bacteria and how just an imbalance of the commensal bacteria could create different signs and symptoms in different people based on what's too high or what's too low. That's messy, right?
Yeah.
We like, that causes diarrhea. I give an antibiotic. I kill that, diarrhea stop, right? That we like that more simple explanation. When it comes to thyroid physiology, we don't really, in allopathic medicine, don't really like to talk about why T4 to T3 conversion may not be going on. That's kind of messy. We don't talk about what's happening at the cell level. The only thing we really talk about is at what point is the gland destroyed enough by the immune system that we have to actually give T4, right? That's really what all we talk about. So the problem is the body's just too nuanced. In school, we broke the body down into the GI tract, right? The stomach, all these different organs, different systems, different tissues. They don't relate. It's easier to study it this way. Just study it in its box. And it makes it easier to study. It makes it easier to be really good at knowing about every aspect of the stomach, but it leaves out how every other system influences that. And so when you have somebody who's a cardiologist and you talk to them about diet, nutrition, they're like, I don't think the GI tract has anything to do with it, right? But you'll see there are some, I think it's Mark Houston, who is a cardiovascular surgeon, right? Who said, when I had to become a good gastroenterologist to become a really good cardiovascular doctor, because early on, I didn't realize the impact of gut health had on the cardiovascular system.
Yeah. And I think that's also where, I mean, some of the more holistic modalities, and again, me personally being trained in Chinese medicine, and when I first started having the symptoms for myself, I was like, oh, wait a minute, I know. This is wind. This is coming from outside of me. This is a different mechanism. So I was able to pinpoint it probably far more quickly than maybe a regular allopathic doctor would, because I look at the body differently. I look at how do all the organs and glands work together? What is the synergy? How are the different patterns, the different influences externally, internally, and put it all together into this perfect balance, yin yang, which is always moving, but in a perfect world where we're healthy, it's always staying balanced, even though it's always moving. So, but that's where, in our current environment, there's just not enough support to keep us balanced. We're out of balance in so many different ways, and not just from our environment, but then we get into the other things that Western medicine doesn't talk about, which is the emotional, the spiritual, the mental. All of that plays a part in these exposures and in any kind of illness as well. And also you want to address the emotional health of a patient, and that's something that doctors don't really like to talk about. When we talk about if a person's sick or having a symptom, they really just overlook the emotions and then think, well, that doesn't really matter. But everything is energy. Emotions are energy. EMFs are energy. Nutrients are energy. Sleep requires a certain amount of peaceful energy. So we put all that together, all these different energies that we really need to have in balance. And as humans in our society, we have strayed so far away from really living in harmony with the environment in which we were created to thrive. And I think the EMFs it has catapulted us to a place where people are so far out of balance. I mean, and I see, because I don't have a cell phone, so I have nothing else to do but to watch people. So, and I see how people, they are just glued to these devices. And I'm thinking, but you just missed those flowers or the birds or all these different things. Like, we're missing that whole part of the balance of feeding ourselves of the things that heal us because of the habit side of it also, in addition to the wireless radiation part of it. So we're starving ourselves of the nature that we thrive in, and then we're bombarding ourselves with this, this man-made frequency that's extremely chaotic, and it's creating havoc. I mean, I can't. We are so far out of balance. We are so far away from how we were created to thrive, and it's showing in our society. It's showing in the health, not only physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually of most people on the planet right now. Unless they're living in a tribe and they're, with their old-fashioned ways, and they're, living in a community with nature. But that's hard to find these days, especially in this country.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a couple things. One, you were talking about the emotional piece, and we say we don't really talk too much about it. I think we do, but I think we've done the wrong thing. We start to label your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions as a disorder, right? Oh, that's sad. You have the reason you have that is because you have this thing called depression.
Yeah.
No, you have some sadness, you have some feelings, you have some emotions, but what we do is we label the signs or symptoms as something. We make up a name, we call it something, and the reason you have those things is this. And so that needs a treatment, a drug to change it, right? You can only manage that. So you're a person who's depressed, has depression, so you need the drug, versus saying, okay, could depression or these signs and symptoms we call depression be the result of adaptive changes or just normal lifestyle, and we need to figure out what does that mean? Why does it make me feel that way? Or, hey, I'm exhausted, so I'm tired. And we talk about the cell danger physiology, and we do see in people who have a cell stress, cell danger physiology going on, many times we make less serotonin, which is a feel-good neurotransmitter. Is that broken physiology or is that adaptive physiology? I think the science is there that says that's an adaptive change. If I'm under threat and stress, do I need to be cheerful and happy, or do I need to fire my brain up to run and get away or protect myself? Yeah. So we make up names like, oh, you just have anxiety. That's why you behave this way. So we need to give you a treatment to say, hey, your body is anxious because there's something creating a sense of danger, and we need to uncover what that is. Is it an organism? Is it a threat? Is it your thinking? Is it a trauma? Is it your lifestyle? Is it your diet? Is it your exposure to these things that's creating it? That's too messy. There's not one thing out there that does it. Let's just give it a name and treat the name versus deal with the client. And I think that's part of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, just going back to specifically the EMFs, I mean, the studies show that the exposures to EMFs actually change the brain chemistry. They change the body's ability to make serotonin and dopamine. I mean, even just the very factor of, I mean, they've seen that even just the screen time, these kids, I mean, it's hitting their dopamine receptors. They can't put it down. They can't live without their screen. It's a constant stimulator for them. And they don't know how to survive without it. So there's that part of it as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that about the brain chemistry, because in a paper that you sent me, there was discussion about how it impacts NPY. So are you comfortable explaining what NPY is and what that might mean and how it might relate to one of the biggest problems we have in the country now, which is obesity?
Yeah, so I haven't specifically looked at that mechanism, so I would love for you to explain it actually.
So one of the things they talk about is, I think there was when from NPY is this neurochemical, and what I take from that is NPY is when you do a lot of mobile phone use, these EMFs that we're getting, that increases this thing called NPY. So what's the big deal? Well, it seems to have an impact on some of the tissue, especially thyroid. It can change some of the tissue, which is concerning. Thought what was even more concerning was NPY in the brain tells the brain you're hungry, which causes you to eat more. And it not only does it cause you to eat more, it's causing you to eat more carbohydrates. And so what's the impact on that? Well, we talked about EMFs can create stress at the cell level, and what I've talked about is how cell stress decreases T4 to T3 conversion, slowing down the metabolism in the cell. We can't put as much food energy through the cell and through the mitochondria to make ATP. There's a down regulation there. It's an adaptive change, in my opinion. But if that's going on at the cell level, if there's damage occurring potentially at the thyroid gland as well, but you're increasing this neurohormone, this neurotransmitter that's telling you you're hungry, and that's going to cause you to eat more carbohydrates, which brings more glucose into the body that you can't utilize effectively because you have low T3 in the cells, your mitochondria are downregulated. So what happens? It starts piling up in the bloodstream. So as it piles up in the bloodstream, what did your body got to do? It's got to make more insulin, because even in a fasted state, you have ways to get glucose into the cell. They're called glucose transporters, but all of them to some degree rely on T3 in the cell to get glucose into the cell. So if there's more glucose in circulation in a fasted state than you need, the body keeps insulin higher. Now, insulin gets all the bad press like it's a bad thing, but that's not the bad thing. There's 4 hormones to raise your glucose. There's only 1 to lower it. Insulin's trying to help out. Like, man, we got to get this stuff somewhere. So what happens as insulin goes up? It starts forcing glucose into the cells. And what cells get, once cells like liver and muscle start to get saturated, where does it go? The excess goes to your adipose tissue. And we store extra calories in the adipose tissue, which does what? Makes us overweight, makes us fat, right? And when we start doing this slowly and steadily over time, the fat cells are trying to help us out. They're releasing a hormone called leptin. That hormone leptin goes to the brain, and it's non-orexigenic, and it's telling the brain, yo, we're storing extra calories here. Stop eating. You don't need to eat. And what happens then is the brain says, oh, we've got extra calories. We're storing extra calories. Increase thyroid metabolism, increase T4 to T3 conversion. Let's speed this process up, increase the sympathetic nervous system. Let's burn this stuff off. But if this is happening slowly and steadily over time, then what happens is too much leptin gets in the system and the brain starts to become leptin resistant. So now not only does the brain not listen to the leptin signal, it also, you've got this NPY that's upregulated. So you're chronically hungry. The hormone that's supposed to tell you to shut down eating keeps going, and you get chronically eating or chronically over consuming. And then because you can't burn it, you store more calories. One more point, as that leptin starts to build up early with low amounts of leptin, it actually stimulates metabolism. High levels of leptin are inflammatory, so it contributes to the problem. Now you got more inflammation in circulation, more downregulation of metabolism, more cell stress response going on. And for those of you, and Kathy may not agree with me on this, but that's okay. She can let me know what she thinks. What the literature shows is what happens in those situations. Well, you have this vitamin, this hormone that everybody seems to be deficient in called vitamin D. Everybody's deficient. Everybody's deficient, right? Really? Maybe we're not measuring it well. What happens to all this vitamin D everybody's consuming, especially in the obese? Well, one of the places it goes into the fat cells. Why does it go there? Well, because it can make those fat cells larger so we can store more stuff, and it tries to manage the inflammation in the system. So then what do? We keep piling more vitamin D into people, which could potentially be problematic. Why? Kathy talked about this before. You increase, the active hormone isn't 25 vitamin D that your doctor's measuring. It's 125 vitamin D. That's what binds to receptors and does all the fun work. But when that 125 vitamin D binds to receptors, it does do a whole bunch of good things, which is why there's short-term studies that show a lot of that stuff. But Kathy talked about calcium entry into the cell and how that increases oxidative stress. Well, the scientific literature also shows that 125 vitamin D can bind to vitamin D receptors and increase the influx of calcium into the cell, causing excessive calcium into the cell and excessive oxidative stress on the cell, potentially contributing to the problem. And what else does 125 vitamin D do? It's supposed to help increase serum calcium, not bone calcium. So by taking all of that, where's the calcium come from? It comes from your GI tract if you have a healthy GI tract and you're eating calcium-rich food, but it can also pull it from the bone, which creates what? Osteopenia and osteoporosis, the whole reason most people are taking vitamin D in the first place. So that's my little rant. Kathy, you're more than welcome to blast me on anything you want, but that's how we have to start looking, in my opinion, at some of this stuff. Instead of being, oh, this one thing is the only thing I have to worry about. This is what we talked about before, is all of these systems are combined. We can't just think it's only one thing. We have to look at the bigger picture of things.
And one of the things you mentioned about the effect on insulin and blood sugar. Also the research shows that the EMF exposures actually damages the pancreas itself. So the pancreas becomes at many levels damaged, so it cannot even produce appropriate insulin. And I have to say that one of the symptoms that I started having, which was so strange to me when I was being overexposed to EMFs, is that my blood glucose was increased. And I'm like, well, that's so strange because I mean, I eat red meat and I eat vegetables. Like that's what I eat. So I'm like, well, why am I having all of a sudden? And it was really just upon the exposure of all the EMFs. And once I was out of that environment, everything went back to normal again. So that's one of the things just on the blood work that I saw that, again, a doctor normally looking at that would never say, hey, are you being overexposed to your wireless radiation? Is that why your blood sugar's higher all of a sudden?
Yeah, and I think that happens all the time. Like somebody goes in, they have high glucose, their hemoglobin A1C's going up. Nobody's looking at the insulin, but they're looking at those things and they're saying, "Hey, you got to change your diet." Oh, really? What do I change it to? I don't know, but you got to change it because you're eating too much sugar.
Yeah.
Really, doc? Do you want to take 3 minutes and ask me what my diet and my exercise routine looks like? What they fail to realize is that glucose doesn't just come from food, right? You have 4 hormones that raise it. One of them, glucagon, that's the one that's constantly trying to make sure there's glucose into the system. So when we're as physicians, we really need to look at that and say, if you have insulin, and I call it glucose resistance, I think insulin gets a bad rap. I call it glucose resistance. When we have glucose resistance, insulin resistance, pre-diabetes, diabetes, we really have to do a better job of asking, okay, tell me about your diet. Tell me about your lifestyle. Tell me what's going on. If they're not a person who's eating a standard American diet and they're like you or me, who's eating more of a paleo-ish, whole food-based diet that's not carbohydrate rich, why would your blood sugar? There must be something resisting it getting into the tissues. And unfortunately, because we only look at glucose and maybe a hemoglobin A1C, we never see the insulin resistance or glucose resistance developing because it's so rare that I see any allopathic physician, and I'm not knocking allopathic medicine. I know that it's just not a standard thing they do, but we have to run insulin or C-peptide to say, okay, to keep that blood sugar at 86, how much insulin is that actually taking? Right? So if it's taking an insulin of 5 to maintain a fasting blood sugar at 86, probably pretty good. But if we look at a fasting blood sugar of 86 and it's taking an insulin of 22 to maintain that, we've got a problem. Houston, we've got a problem, right? But we run limited labs and we don't like to look at big pictures because a third party is often paying for it. And they're like, don't worry about it. We'll deal with the insulin when they're diabetic. That's where we really run into some serious problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
So I want to talk about one more thing, and then we're going to get into in the last session here, we're going to get into things people can do. But there was another piece in that paper that talked about heat shock proteins. And for people who don't, some people know, some people don't know, people do saunas to try and release heat shock proteins, which are part of the immune and cell defense mechanism. So we get into these things, we release these heat shock proteins for a short period of time, which is beneficial, helps kind of stimulate the immune system, kind of toughen it up and make it more functional. But what they found with EMF exposure, and I don't know if you saw that aspect of it or you're familiar with it, but it actually showed a significant drop in heat shock proteins with regular EMF. And they took the EMF away, the heat shock proteins went back. Did you see that? Are you familiar with that?
I didn't get a chance to look at that deeply. Yeah.
So, which is interesting because a lot of us are talking about, hey, sauna, awesome, cold therapy, for cold shock proteins. And we're like, we got to do these things on a regular basis. And I think they're beneficial and you should, but here's another reason that it might be good to do these things. If you're spending all the time with your cell phone, that's depleting part of this innate immune response, you got to start doing some other things, not just put it down, but doing some of those other things are beneficial. Now, spending a lot of time with the EMFs in the sauna, probably not a great idea though. It's very counterproductive. So let's talk about what somebody can do. If somebody's now willing to say, okay, these invisible things I can't see, hear, touch, or feel or smell are potentially creating problems, how the heck am I supposed to know if it's a problem for me? So you talked about a biological engineer coming in and maybe looking at your property or your office or your home. But let's start talking about strategies, because people hear a podcast like this and go, oh yeah, and here's another thing I can't do anything about, but they can. So being realistic that somebody is not getting rid of their cell phone, let's talk about the things that they can do to mitigate the damage, maybe in their home, maybe on a daily basis. Is there something they can do to reduce the exposure if they're carrying a cell phone? So can we work our way through that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that there's a lot of little devices you can put on your phone and that kind of thing, and those are fine. I really am though more about a quantitative measurement. I really invite people to get a meter. This is actually an older meter, but something very simple like this. It's less than $200. It's a Cornet electrosmog meter. It measures. The newer ones actually measure into the 5G spectrum, and you can measure your exposure. So you know exactly what you're being exposed to, and then you can do a before and an after you've done the mitigation process. So when I talk about reducing exposures, I'm talking about specifically things that you can do in your own home, because of course you can't control what other people are doing outside. You can't move the cell phone tower. You can't control what's going on outside of your own home, but in your own home, you can do things like at night when you go to bed, if you do use Wi-Fi, just go ahead and just turn that off. You don't need to be on it anyway. You can just shut the Wi-Fi off. That gives the body the ability to rest and recover and go into more of a less chaotic state. Also, with using cell phones themselves, you can use either what I would call a tubed device to put in your ears. One of the things that I don't like are these AirPods, because the AirPods themselves, if people put a meter up to their head and when they have these things on, they would never put them in their ears. I mean, there's so much radiation coming out of them, whether you're on the phone or not. So there are tubed headsets, and that's going to be where the tube itself, it basically mitigates that frequency from moving into the ear, from the device into the ear. So that can help not only reduce the electrical frequency that's going near to the brain, but you can allow yourself to keep the phone farther away from you, or just speak on speakerphone and not put the phone up to your head. And even the manufacturers talk about that, is that in the phone itself, they'll say right in there, if you're concerned about radiation, don't put the phone on your body, don't carry it in your pocket, don't put it next to your head. So even the manufacturers say that. Their lawyers made them put that in there. So just keeping the device away from you, because distance is always going to be your friend. The closer the device is to you, the more exposure you're going to have. And that is.
Let me interrupt you for a second. From a home perspective, turn the Wi-Fi off. I can hear it because I have the same discussion with clients, but I can hear somebody going, yeah, like every night I'm going to go down and turn it off. What you can do is you can get a timer like we do with our Christmas lights in holiday season, or on my outdoor patio lights, and you can get a little timer that you can say, I want it on, turn it off for 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever. And so it'll be on for a certain period of time and it'll automatically turn it off at night. So it takes the thought process wholly out of the picture. So I wanted to inject that. The second thing I wanted to talk about, you talk about tubed headsets. So the iPhones, when they came out, had corded headsets. Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about tubed headsets?
No, that's better than an AirPod, but a tubed headset is something that you can find easily, probably on the internet, anywhere people sell them who are into reducing radiation exposures. It looks sort of like a wired headset, but instead of the wire in this area between the actual little speaker or microphone area, there's a tube. It's a clear tube or a colored tube. It's just literally an air tube, and the sound frequencies move through that tube instead of through the wires. So it's like a stop between, not having that wired frequency going right into the ear, right into the brain itself. I'm one of those people, I can feel all the frequencies. So even when I would use just a regular wired headset, I could feel the frequencies deep into my brain. Now, when I used a tubed headset, I don't feel that anymore. So, I can feel that that is being mitigated. So I prefer the tubed. If you can't do tube, then I would definitely do wired, and definitely don't do wireless. So that's not going to be optimal, is for sure.
So the other thing we want to consider is everybody now has these tracking devices, Oura Ring, Whoop Strap, BioStrap, all these devices, Fitbits, what's your suggestions around those things? Because I have certain suggestions I make for clients. I think it's great to have some of that technology, but there's good and bad with that technology. But let's talk about from a EMF perspective, what if they want to be doing this stuff, what are the recommendations?
I mean, in my opinion, is maybe not that popular because I'm not a huge fan of those. I mean, you can use them maybe for a period of time to check in with, what's really going on right now. When I'm feeling a certain way, let's check in. Let's see what's going on. What's my heart rate? What are my sleep patterns on certain nights? But then, I mean, they all emit radiation. So you have to take that into consideration with your overall exposures, and then also how sensitive you are. For me, I'm more of a naturalist, so I like to check in with myself. I like to be my own monitor. How am I feeling? And I think that's something that the technology has done. It's separated us from ourselves. It's separated us from really checking in with the inside, saying, what is this that I'm feeling? What are these emotions? What's my heart rate? Do I feel, sweaty? Do I feel anxious? Do I feel these different things? Where's that coming from? And I think we allow a device to tell us how we're feeling instead of us really being connected within ourselves, which for me, I'm more of a let's connect back to ourselves. Let's connect back to nature and really check in with how we feel and be more in touch with our intuition and our own innate ability to know how we feel. And again, that's not a popular answer, but that's ultimately what I would prefer.
Yeah. So the other thing that we can do, if you have those devices, one of the things to consider is turn off the sync, right? So don't have that on constantly on, turn off the connectivity to it. You can have it, if you have it on your body, have it on your body. And then when you're charging your device, hit the sync. So those things, it's only occurring when you don't have it on you, right? So, hey, I take it off. I sync it while it's charging, and you potentially reduce some of that exposure. What recommendations, and do you know much about the things that people can, because they're going to carry their phone. People dudes put it in their back pocket. Sometimes they put it in their front pocket. I've seen women put their phone in their purse, in their bra. I've seen them put it everywhere. They're not going to stop doing that. Obviously, we could say, hey, the best thing to do is not carry it on your person, but if you don't, unless you have a Mercer or a purse, it's still going to be on your person probably. So do these things, these protective coverings work? How do you know what's a good one and what's not a good one? Are you aware of those things?
So one of the ones that I love is from Safe Living Technologies, and it's actually a Faraday bag. So you can actually carry the phone. Let me see if I have one here. Yeah, I do. It just looks like this. It just looks like it's a little bag. It's made of a material that actually blocks the frequencies because again, it's the frequencies that carry the packets of information that are coming in and out of your device. So if you want to carry it on your body, you can put it in the little pouch, put it in your purse, put it in your pocket, and even you can still, see through it a little bit, so you can still look at the phone. Another thing you can do is when you're not actually actively on the phone or using it, you can put it into airplane mode. You can turn off the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth. So that's something that you can do where you can control when the device is actually emitting frequencies. And that's something that we can do, again, not only just for our own safety exposures, but just for our own peace of mind and kind of breaking that addiction of constantly looking at it. Because if it's not on, we can't continually check in with it and give our brains a break and check back in with nature and some of the things that are going on around us instead of what's going on in our phone.
So sometimes you'll see phone cases that have protective coating that fold over, but now you still have three sides of it that are exposed. Does that reduce the exposure or it's still there?
It can actually increase the exposure because when the phone is when the signal is lower, the phone is actually working harder to make a stronger signal, to make a stronger connection. So in some cases, it can actually increase your exposure. Maybe not directly on the skin, because a lot of times those areas where it has the actual area, it's that is up against your skin, but it's coming out sideways. So it's, it is still coming out, and it can actually be increasing your exposures, unfortunately. So that's
So it all,
it.
whatever case you're going to put it in really needs to be completely closed.
It would need to be more like this, where it's not emitting any frequencies.
But the phone is still emitting frequencies, but the Faraday bag blocks them from being.
It. Yeah, it blocks it.
Okay, so we can turn off our Wi-Fi at night, right? That's one thing. We can use our cell phones away from our body. How about just using the speaker versus putting headphones in, right?
Yeah, speaker's good. One of the things that I have done is because I still do have a cell phone, but I never actually use it. I can forward it to my home phone. I know people don't have home phones anymore. They don't have landlines, but if you do, you can actually forward your number to your home phone and talk on your home phone. You can do that as well. That's something, an option. Another way to reduce exposures to wireless is going to be simply to hardwire your home. Back in the day when we had just all Ethernet, the frequencies are safely within those Ethernet protective cords. It's not emitting out into our space. And besides that, who decided for us that we need to be wireless everywhere, when really Ethernet is much safer for us, and it's more secure because you can't hack into an Ethernet connection. It's far more secure. And that's what you'll see even banks and government agencies, they're going to be using more of the Ethernet connections rather than Wi-Fi.
Okay. So we talked about that. We said, hey, for the devices that sync in Bluetooth, try and turn those syncs and Bluetooths off. So if you're not using them, so that creates exposure. Other things like maybe not having it, moving the charging, when you're charging your phone, plugging it in, maybe moving it away from your head when you're sleeping, right? Probably a good idea. Or doing them having them in another room. Obviously, people are like, well, I need my phone in case something happens to my kids or something like that. But maybe having it across the room, maybe having it not right next to us.
Distance is always your friend. I mean, there's people who sleep with their phone under their pillow. I'm like, please stop doing that. You're frying your brain.
Isn't that, if you put this podcast on with the phone underneath the pillow, doesn't it help you learn stuff? They take this all in? No, that's not true. All right, forget that part. So we've got a bunch of things. Where can somebody get resources that are going to give them some more information? Is there places that you like to send people to get more information?
So one of the biggest places for just scientific information, for the latest legislative, legal information, is going to be Environmental Health Trust. So that's ehealthtrust.org or ehtrust.org. And they have most up-to-date information about all the recent science, the recommendations. I'm really pleased that a lot of the different states are creating more guidance for its citizens, especially the more vulnerable, such as children, pregnant mothers, in order to reduce their exposures. So that site, Environmental Health Trust, is going to be a wonderful site for that. As far as any kind of protective or shielding materials, I really love Safe Living Technologies. They also work with a lot of the building biologists. So they're going to be the suppliers for the building biologists. If you do have one come to your home or your business, and they tell you, okay, well, we need to shield this wall because there's Wi-Fi on the other side. And if you're sitting here all day long, you're getting bombarded with the Wi-Fi. So we could just reduce that exposure. They have the different materials to do that as well. So those are the quantitative materials to actually measure and block and remediate are going to be at Safe Living Technologies. And then, of course, the science is always going to be available at Environmental Health Trust.
Okay. And I hate to say this, but I almost have to say it, is because we've got so many people trying to con the system. Like, there's going to be the voices that say none of this is a problem. There's going to be people trying to take advantage of people. So these are the places that if you really want more vetted, more honest information, that's the place to go. Because guaranteed there's somebody making the protective case that's, hey, this is going to protect you from everything, but it may not be anything more than hard plastic.
Correct. Yeah. I am really much more into quantitative science, peer reviewed. That's gonna be the safest. And I had to learn that the hard way, because when I first started going through this process, or even before I realized it became sensitive, is I actually really depended on my cell phone. I had this little gadget thing. I had the little, little thing that you stick on your phone, and it said, well, this will protect you. It'll harmonize all the frequencies. And even then, with that on my phone, I could still feel it. Like I could still feel the tingling in my hands. And I said, well, I can still feel it. What's wrong? Oh, we don't know, And I think for me, if I had known the science and not depended on what someone told me to do, like, here, just put this little gadget on your phone, I probably would not have become so severely sensitive or had an overexposure, because I would have been more mindful about what the real science is and not what the latest gadget was. So I had to learn that the hard way. So I really encourage people to measure. One of the biggest things you can do, again, is get a meter, see it for yourself. And nothing goes farther than actually looking for yourself to see, what is my phone emitting? What is my tracking device emitting? How far do I have to be away from my Wi-Fi router to be in a relatively safe zone? And when you see it for yourself, it's quantitative, the measurements don't lie, you're going to be much more safe that way. And I'm really more into quantitative.
So I don't know if you can do this off the top of your head, but if somebody says, okay, I get this thing, what's the safe level? What should I be looking for?
Well, that's the difficult part, because the safe level is, honestly, it's going to be much lower than what any of your devices are emitting. And that goes back to the FCC and the fact that all of these devices that we have, they've been approved based on the FCC's guidelines, which were based on heat. And that's not how non-ionizing radiation really damages in the long run. So all of our safety requirements mean nothing. They mean nothing. Like, none of these devices would actually be approved if we were using actual, real safety limits. So that's where we are. And unfortunately, that's the hard information, is that it's very difficult to find a safe level other than hardwiring, keeping a distance. For example, when I turn this meter on, in my room, it's very, very low. So it's going to be below 0.00 milliwatts per meter squared. Anything for me over 1 is going to be too high, especially for a long-term exposure. But when you get a meter and you look at your phone and what's coming out of it, it's going up to 500 to 1,000 all the time. And people are carrying that in their pocket, and they have no idea that it really needs to be below 1 point.
Okay, so that's what I really wanted to know, because somebody's going to get it and go, I don't know, it's 500. I think that's good. I don't know. So they really want it to be less than 1 would be awesome, right?
But I'm going to tell you, none of the devices are going to meet the safety standards. And I love these because they do have this cool little, you can't see it over here because there's no orange or red in my office because it's very clean in here. That this will actually pop up and there'll be like an orange and a red. It'll tell you, danger, danger, get away from that. So these meters do come with a measuring range to show you, this is high, this is danger, you need to get away from this.
And it's called an electric smog meter, something like that.
Yeah,
they Google it.
This is just one of the meters. And again, I would recommend going to Safe Living Technologies, and they have a lot of different options, and they are so wonderful. They've been doing this for a really long time. If you email them, call them, say, I'm looking for the best meter, this is my situation, they will guide you to the very best meter for your needs. They're fantastic. They've helped a lot of people. And again, they are really into the hard science and looking at how to truly help people reduce their exposures in a real quantitative and realistic way.
Awesome. All right, Kathy, I definitely want to be respectful for your time. We're under the radar here for how much time I said we would spend. But can you give people, some people may want to know a little bit more about you, may want to know if there's since especially if it's something that they think is a really big deal for them and something they have concern about, where can they find out more about you, what you do, where you're located?
Sure. Yeah, so I have a website. It is drkathyveon.com. That's drkathyveon.com. And my website has a tremendous amount of information. I have a lot of blog posts. I have a resources page. I mean, my resources page alone, even down at the bottom, I have a lot of information on where to find a good meter, where to find shielding products, different books where you can learn more. All about structured water, which is another thing we didn't really talk about, but things that help to keep our cells strong. So different mechanisms there to be supportive in that way. But that's the main place to reach me. Is my website is drkathyveon.com.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. This is something that we really haven't done an in-depth conversation on, so I'm glad we got a chance to do it. For the listener, you might have to listen to this a couple times. You might have to have a little internal self-discussion with yourself to say, hey, maybe this thing that I'm doing all my TikToking on and my chit-chatting on or whatever it is, could be, especially when you've gone to functional medicine practitioner after functional medicine practitioner and you've done all the mold and all these other things, maybe something like your exposure to these things may be the thing that's allowing molds to have a great environment to live in, or some other organism to say, hey, this is a fantastic place to be in. Look at all the chaos here. This is awesome for me to hang out. And maybe you don't need one more treatment for those things. Maybe you just need to think about what's contributing to my excessive stress load. Dr. Kelly Halderman and I talk about that under our environmental fitness section of the book, because it's a piece, and we just give introductories into all these fitness factors in the book, in our book, but there's books and books and books that are just written about this type of stuff. Yeah. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and hey, it was a great conversation. It went by really fast. So maybe we'll get you back on and have another conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you and your listeners as well.
Awesome. Have a fantastic holiday. And for the listeners, keep listening and keep putting out great positive comments and giving us a good rating on wherever you watch or listen to your podcast.